Hello Spartans, today I'm excited to start a new segment called Security Automation, where I will share some ideas for tools that can help you as a professional or simply as someone trying to learn the craft. Regardless of the cyber field that you choose, being able to investigate indicators such as domains, IPs, and hashes is a must. And sometimes manually searching thousands of indicators using Google is not really feasible. This video serves as a great introduction to basic Python functionality as well as REST APIs. Now, if you are a total beginner to Python or even programming, this video may be hard to follow. I will skip environment preparation and I will assume that you already have Visual Studio Code installed as well as Python. If you feel that I should dive deeper into environment setup, let me know in the description and I'll make sure to cover it in my next video. But enough talking, bring in the intro. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, today we are going to use Python and a REST API. And the REST API that we are going to use today is VirusTotal's REST API. For the ones that don't know what VirusTotal is basically a platform used to investigate threats. You can imagine it as a database of malware and malicious indicators. And it's quite used by threat researchers, reverse engineers, and even incident responders. Now, more specifically, our objective is to combine these two technologies and start with this and end with something like this, where for each domain, you have not only the categories according to VirusTotal, but also a score. The input is going to be simply a list of domains and the output is going to be a CSV with the results. First things first, we need an entry point for our program. So we are going to start by creating a main.py file. We start with a simple hello world just to test our basic script. And it seems to be working. Now let's move on to something more complex. The first step is going to be parsing two arguments because our script is going to require two arguments. One of them is the file for the list of domains, while the second argument is going to be the file, the output file where we want to store the results. We start by importing argparse, which is going to be used for this. And we are going to use the following description for our prompt. Now that we have the parser object, we are going to start adding arguments. And we are going to need two arguments. One of them is going to be called domains file, while the second is going to be named reports file. Now, if you are wondering what's the difference between the first argument and the second, the first one is going to be the internal field inside the Python object that we are going to use to obtain the argument that we pass to the program, while the second one is simply a string that is printed to you as a help prompt in case you don't know what the argument is or what's the purpose of the argument. So now we are going to parse the arguments and we are going to obtain the arguments and save them in variables that we can use later. Now that we have our prompt finished, let's test it. First we run Python without any arguments and we notice that the Python interpreter is printing an error saying that there are arguments missing. One of them is domains file, the other one is reports file. Before we test this, it's a good idea to create files with domains and the proper folders. So in the same project folder, we are going to create two folders. One of them is going to be a folder called inputs and another folder called outputs. Inside the inputs folder, we are going to create a file called domains. And inside this file, we are going to paste a list of domains. And I've chosen a list or a set of domains that I found in a CoinMiner feed on GitHub. Now, because we want to start by testing this script with just one domain, I'm going to create a second file, and that second file is going to have a single domain. So we copy and we paste, and let's call it domains test. And in this case, we are just going to keep the first domain. And we don't need to create anything on outputs because this is where we are going to store the result of the execution of our program. Now to test it, we are going to print the arguments. Now we run the script and you pass as the first argument inputs domains.txt. I'm going to pass the full list rather than the test list because right now we are simply testing the print. And as the second argument, I'm going to pass this. And as you can see, it printed our arguments. Now that we have our command line parsing functionality implemented, it is time to move on to reading files. Now, if you follow my channel, I'm always advocating for you to write proper modular code, even if that means that you write a single file with just a single function. And the reason for this is that in the future, you may want to expand your program and add more functionality, and abstracting the functionality of your program is the best you can do in that case. So for that reason, we are going to create a module called utils. And inside this folder, we are going to create a Python file called file. Now, what we are going to implement here is simply a function that receives as an argument a path for a file, and it's going to read the entire file, split it by lines, and return a list of strings. In this case, it's going to be a list of domains. The reason for this is because it's much easier for us to work with these domains in the rest of the code. So we start by defining the function called read file lines, and this file lines receives a file path. Now the code is pretty simple. We start by opening the file in read mode because we just want to read, not write. And we store the handle. In this case, we call it a handle. Let's call it a object that you can use then to reference that file. We store it in a variable called file, which is why I say as file. Then we simply read the lines. And finally, we return the lines. And lines in this case is actually a list of strings. But let's check if it worked. First, we need to import our new module. And in this case, we are going to keep one of the prints because we want to test that this worked. And we are going to say file utils, which is our new module. And we are going to call read file lines. And we are going to pass as an argument the path for the input file. Now, as usual, we test it. Now, the reason why I decided to use file read split lines rather than simply file read lines is because the latter is going to read the entire file, split it by new lines, but is going to append the new lines to each of the strings. And we simply don't want that. Now we test again the program and we have our list of domains. Now that we have our list of domains, it is time to write the code to query VirusTotal API. Now, once more, we are going to create a specific folder for our VirusTotal code. Let's call it VT. And inside VT, we are going to create a file called, say, api.py. Now, in order for you to use the VirusTotal API, you are going to need an API key. And in order for you to obtain the API key, you need to follow this process. Once you create an account with VirusTotal API and you confirm the email, etc., you log in, and then you go to the top right corner and you click this and you go to API key. And there you are going to get a string that you copy, and then you are going to use it to set up a local environment variable that is then going to be used by the program. Don't worry, it's going to become more clear, but for now, just go there and get your API key, which is basically a string of random characters. We are going to start by creating our function that is going to get the report using the REST API. Now, to use the REST API, you need a endpoint to connect to and to send your request. And in order for you to find out about this endpoint, you have to go to the documentation of the REST API provider. And in this case, as you can see, for domains and get a domain report, the endpoint is this one, where basically it starts with this static string, hard-coded, while this one is your domain. And as you can see, there is something else here called XAPI key. This is the parameter that we are going to use to pass our API key so we can authenticate our request. Otherwise, VirusTotal is going to say you don't have permissions to query this API. You need an API key for that. So we start by defining the base URL, and we also need to provide the authentication. And the authentication goes inside a HTTP header. In this case, we are going to define the headers. We have our headers defined, but we need to get the API key. Now, there are multiple ways you can add the API key to your code. Some of them are more secure than others, but hard coding the API key as a variable is usually not a good idea. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use what is called an environment variable. Environment variable is some value that is stored usually temporarily by your console, unless it's persisted on the session of the console. is something that you can use as a value that is used just once, and once you restart your computer, it disappears. So that means that even if an attacker breaks into your computer, it's not easy for him or her to actually get to your API key. In this case, we are going to use an environment variable, as I mentioned, and to get an environment variable, you need to reference it using Python. In this case, we are going to use OS environment, and the name of the API key is going to VT API key. You can choose whatever name you want. In this case, I've decided to use VT API key, and I have to import OS first. Now, I'm not going to set up the API key yet. I'm just going to run it as it is in a few seconds. It's going to fail because it's not authenticated, and then we add the API key. I'm just going to write the code for now. As you have noticed, the domain needs to be attached to this base URL, so let's do it. Let's do exactly that. Now, in this case, I'm using the notation for a formatted string in Python, which was really not necessary. I could simply concatenate both strings straight away, but I find that this notation is much better and more clear, so I'm going to use it. What is happening here right now is that I'm combining the original URL with the domain that is passed as a parameter to create a final URL that you see on the documentation. Then we are going to perform a GET request, HTTP request to REST API to get the report that we want. And as expected, we need to import the requests module. Once the request is performed, we need to obtain the result and return it back to the function that is calling this function. In this case, when we perform a HTTP GET request, we need to check what is the return code and hope that is 200. 200 means okay, it means the request went well. Otherwise, something went wrong, and in that case, we need to return null or return nothing because it didn't work. So we need to check first the response code, and we are going to define a field called JSON response because the response from the server is going to be in JSON format. This is the situation where the code is 200, everything is okay, but we also need to account for the case when it is not. In this case, we are going to do a simple print. Once more, I'm going to use the formatted string notation, and in this case, it makes much more sense. And we are going to say request failed with status code. And in this case, we are going to say response status code. And in this case, we are going to return none. Because it didn't work, we are not going to return a JSON or anything that is valid. We are going to return none. And this is a basic function to query VirusTotal's REST API. Let's test it now. Once more, we are going to import the module, import vt.api as vt.api. And I'm going to create a variable called domains report. And this variable is going to store the result from our call to the VirusTotal API module. Now, some of you are probably noticing that I'm actually passing a list of domains to a function that only receives one domain. It's totally correct. So what I'm going to do here now to simplify is that I'm going to just choose the first domain on this list and pass it to this function. And then later we are going to create another function that receives a list of domains. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to use a test file rather than the full list of domains because there is a quota on VirusTotal, and at the same time it makes it easier to troubleshoot because the output that is returned from the REST API is quite verbose. So we are going to switch to test, and we are going to run this. And as you can see, there was an error because this environment variable is not defined. So let's define the environment variable now. The way for you to define this environment variable and set your VirusTotal API key is going to be using this command on Linux and macOS. Like this, and then you just add your key here. Now I'm going to do a quick cut, and I'm going to add my key. Now my key is set up, so we are going to try again. So now let's print the results from getReport given domain for the first domain. And as you can see, this is what the REST API returns, which looks like a bunch of gibberish. This is actually JSON. So it is now time for us to actually convert this into something that is readable and makes sense. The reason why we need to convert this first and we need to take a look at what is inside is because we need to choose which fields we are going to add to our report, and for this we need to know exactly where they are inside the JSON structure. Fortunately, Python has capabilities to actually print JSON in a beautified way, and I'm going to now write the code exactly for that. This is going to be the code, and you need to import the JSON module as expected. And now we need to pass it as an input, domains report. Now we are going to print everything again. And this time, as you can see, it's much more organized. Now, what we need to do now is we need to go over this JSON, and we need to find out which fields are we interested in. And for this, first of all, we are going to redirect the output of this script to a file, and then we are going to look at it in Visual Studio Code. So we are going to run this file again, and we are going to output these two outputs, and let's call it JSON example, or actually report example, JSON. Now, if we open it, we can see that it's much more attractive. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we are going to focus on just a few parts of this report. We are interested in knowing the categories, which are here on top. We are also interested in the analysis stats. We want to know how many AVs or security solutions deem this domain as malicious. And that is actually about it. We just need three fields. We need the domain, we need the categories, and we need the AV scores. Now, as you can see, if we look at this structure, we see that this is a dictionary because of this part here, these curly braces. And then we have the first level, it's data, which is also another dictionary. We have attributes and we have categories. So we have to access data, attributes, categories, and we are going to obtain another dictionary which contains the categories that we are looking for. And then for our analysis stats, we are going to need first two things. We are going to need the number of malicious verdicts, and we are going to need the size of this list, because we want to know how many AVs analyzed this domain or provided a verdict, and we also want to know how many of these provided a malicious verdict. But how does that translate into code? Now, as you notice, this JSON returned by the REST API of VirusTotal is huge, and we don't really need all of this information. So what we are going to do is we are going to add a function inside of the VirusTotal API module, which is going to extract the fields that we need, and it's going to return a dictionary with the ones that we actually need and drop the rest. We are going to start by defining this function, and this function is going to be called generate simple domain report, and it's going to receive the original domain report, which is going to be that JSON. Now, this function is going to be a bit long because since we are messing with dictionaries and structures, and when we are indexing an object, we need to make sure that the keys actually exist. So that means that we need to add a lot of if-elses to make sure that our code doesn't break if the REST API returns something else that it's not expected. And for this final report, we are going to have a couple of fields. One of them is going to be the categories field, the score field, and the domain field. Now, some of you may point out, why don't you just pass the domain as an argument here, so you don't have to find it inside the structure? But for consistency purposes, I find that it's better to just use the JSON only rather than passing extra arguments. So first of all, what we are going to do is we are going to check if data exists in that original report. Then we need to make sure that the domain is part of this report as well. And domain here is indexed by the key ID, which is somewhere here, like here. So what we are going to do next is we are going to get the value of ID, which is our domain. We are going to do if ID in original report. And now, because this is a dictionary, we are going to index data. So it must be inside data equals, and then we are simply going to copy original data ID. And now we add this field to our final report because we want it. Now that we have our domain field, let's go for the other fields. And the next field is going to be categories. So next we have to confirm that attributes we can actually copy because it's something similar to this line. And we do if attributes are part of original data, because they should be inside, then what we are going to do, we are going to check if categories is inside these attributes. So we have to do if. Once more, we can actually copy, because this is nested check. We can say if categories is in original report data, but now we also need to do attributes. And now what we are going to do is we are going to generate a string based on each of these categories. And we are going to separate this string by pipes. And the pipe, in case you don't know what it is, it's this symbol. So for that reason, I'm going to add to these categories here a pipe first, meaning that the first character is going to be a pipe, then it's going to be a category, then another pipe, then the second category, so on and so forth. So right now we are going to need to iterate on each one of these. So we are going to do for. And in case you are confused, these categories is actually another dictionary where each key is this one on the left and the value is the one on the right. In this case, we are only interested on the part that is on the right. If you want, you can add a part that it's on the left, but it's totally up to you. In this case, I will just simply keep the category. So this underscore here just means that the field is not assigned to any variable because it's not going to be used. And I forgot that we need to, because this is a dictionary, we need to iterate using this. Now what we are going to do is simply this category, which is the value that you see, categories actually, which is the value that you see on the top. And you are going to do plus equals, which basically means concatenation. And we are going to apply, and in this case, you are going to simply use category. And you are also going to add another pipe to separate between categories. Finally, we are going to add these new categories to our original or to our final report that is going to be returned by this function. There is one last thing missing, which is the score. And the score is slightly more complicated. And in this case, we are actually interested in the number of AVs or security solutions that deem this domain to be malicious. And for simplicity, because the code is going to just repeat itself, I'm going to advance this video and I'm going to show you what the result looks like for this last segment. Now, as you can see, what I did here was I started by checking that last analysis results are part of the attributes, and the last analysis results contains the list of AV vendors and also the verdict. And in this case, what I'm doing is I'm basically applying a length, which is a basic function of Python that returns the size of a given structure. In this case, is the size of the dictionary. And this is going to give me the total number of AV vendors. And then once we have the total number of AV vendors, we still need to know how many of them deemed this domain to be malicious. And this is where last analysis stats comes in. We are interested in the malicious. So the next thing I'm going to check is that the last analysis stats is part of original report data attributes, as you can see here. If last analysis stats appears there, the next thing that I'm going to check if malicious appears there as well. Remember that we must always assume that the API can return anything and our program must not crash. So in this case, I check if malicious is part of original report data attributes last analysis stats, as you can see here. If you are familiar with JSON and dictionaries, this makes a lot of sense to you. If you are completely new to this, it may be a bit more complicated. So I suggest that you find some tutorial on basics of Python and dictionaries, data structures, etc. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating a string once more for the score, and the string is basically a simple number of malicious, number of AVs that deem these to be malicious, / total number of vendors. So this gives me, say, 8 out of 80 AV vendors deem this to be malicious. And if malicious is not part of this, then the malicious count is going to be set to a dash, which means that it's not available. And we still return something that makes more or less sense. Finally, we do final report score, so we store this score string in our final report. And as you can expect, the last thing to be done is returning the final report. Now, as you can see, this function is not being called yet, so let's call this function. And this function is going to be called once we get the JSON response from the REST API. Now what we are going to do is simply apply this function to JSON response. Something that you may be wondering is why did I add this underscore here? This is to make this function private to this module so that it cannot be exported and used somewhere else. This is useful because sometimes you have functions that are simply utilitarian functions that don't make sense outside of a module. So in this case, this is one. I don't want this to be called anywhere else. So now we are going to test it to see what returns. And at first run, it seems that it didn't work properly. And once I was troubleshooting, I realized that I missed something. I checked if categories were part of data attributes, but then I forgot to actually index these categories here. So that was my mistake. So now, hopefully, it should work. And as you can see, we have the result that we expected. We have categories, we have the domain, and we have the score. 8 out of 89 AV vendors consider this domain malicious. Now at this point, we already have the code to read the file, to parse the file, and to query VirusTotal. However, there are still some details that we need to fix here. The first one of them is that currently this function only supports one domain, and we want to be able to support several domains. So we are going to create a second function that is going to call this function. We are going to return a list of reports. So we declare a list like this. Now we need to iterate over these domains. So we go with for domain in domains, and we are going to write reports dot append, which means that we are going to append to the list. And what are we going to append to the list? We are going to append to the list a report that is generated by the function that is above. So we are going to write get report given domain, and we are going to call it with domain. Now, of course, you could call this function above, assign it to a variable, then pass this variable to append. But in this case, we can do it in a single line. And then finally, we simply return reports. So this time we are going to call the function get. We are removing this, and we are going to call the other function that we declared called get reports for domains. And now we are going to call it domains reports. And now we are going to simply print the result of get reports for domains. And as you can see, we have a list of domains. Currently, you only have one domain, but let's use the old list now, the original list with all the domains, and see how it looks like. As you can see in this case, it returns what we want, but for all the domains that were part of the list. So the script seems to be working fine, but there are still some details and still some parts of the code that are missing to make this code much more robust. At the end of the day, we just want something quick and dirty sometimes, but if we are building a larger code base, we want to make sure that the code is resilient against any exceptions, errors, or unusual content returned by the API. Now, a while ago, I launched into a long-winded rant on exceptions and how you should create exception blocks. The truth is that I want to make this video as simple as possible, and I don't want to get into too many details. Exception handling in Python and in any language is complex, and you should try to handle to the best of your abilities to make sure that your program runs smoothly. The quick and dirty approach to handling exceptions is usually to just create a try except block where you catch and cast, in this case for the ones that are familiar with programming language, every exception thrown by either your program or any other exception thrown by the Python library or other library into the generic base class exception. Exceptions are usually thrown by either your code or some library that you use, or even the Python library, to signal that there has been a problem. For instance, if you try to open a file that doesn't exist, the Python runtime is going to throw an exception that you must handle somehow. Ideally, you should simply exit your program and notify the user that the file doesn't exist, but you can try to do something else instead. Regardless, for simplicity purposes, I'm going to cast all the exceptions for all the functions that I call into the base exception. Now there is one last piece missing, which is the code responsible for converting your lists of reports or a list of dictionaries into a CSV. And this is what we are going to do now. Once more, we are going to create a file under utils called csv.py, and we are going to create a function called save lists of dictionaries as CSV. And as an input, we are going to receive a list of dictionaries and the path for the CSV file where this report is going to be stored. And if you remember, this was actually one of our arguments. If you are familiar with the CSV format, when you look at the top, you see a header of the CSV, which usually gives you the name of each field that appears below. So the first step is actually getting this header. And how do we do that? Because this is a list of dictionaries, each dictionary is going to contain the exact same field. So what we are going to do is we are going to get the first element of this list, and we are going to get the keys, which are actually the names of the fields. Next, we are going to open the file as we have done before, but instead of reading, we are going to write. And in this case, we are going to add an extra parameter called new line, because the new line is going to be handled by the CSV module. Then we are going to create a CSV writer, and we actually need to import a CSV module. And we are going to use a dict writer, which is basically an object that is able to convert a dictionary into a CSV. We pass the CSV file as the first argument, and then we pass the field names which we obtained before. Then we are going to write the headers. And now it's time to call this function. Because we are going to need once more a try except block, I'm simply going to copy this block and just change a few things here and there. We need to import CSV utils, and now we are going to call CSV utils with domains reports list. Now we just need to change the error message to make sure that it's congruent. Copy paste is not a problem as long as you pay attention and change what needs to be changed. We remove the argument because this doesn't return anything. And finally, we can remove or comment out this because it's no longer necessary. And it seems that we had an error. And the error is actually the output path that is missing, which we call reports file. And lo and behold, we have our report CSV. We can see it right here. These are the domains that we initially provided to the script. These are the categories, and these are the scores. And our script is finished. And we have reached the end of this video, Spartans. Today I've decided to switch things up a little bit and talk about security automation, which is one of my biggest passions. It is a fact that at some point in your life you are going to be forced to investigate some indicators such as IPs, domains, or even file hashes. You may get just a couple of them, but chances are you may get thousands of them. And with such high number of indicators, there is no way you can search these manually using Google or even VirusTotal. This script is simple yet powerful because it allows you to sift through thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of domains and focus on the ones that are relevant for your investigation. This script, regardless of the modularity and some exception handling, still requires a lot of fine-tuning to make it much better and more robust. But today I wanted to make things simple because I know that a lot of you are not really experienced coders, and adding extra detail is only going to make things more complicated for you. Regardless, I hope you enjoy this segment. If you don't, please let me know in the description, and also let me know in the description if there is something that you want me to focus on in the upcoming videos. Until next time, stay safe, Stay paranoid.